It's the 1570s and I find myself in Eindhoven, tucked away in the Netherlands, when the city's stadtholder, Diederik Sonoy, decides he wants a private word with me. Right away, I can tell it's no small matter. Our land is choking on violence and upheaval. Since 1556, the Spanish Empire has had its grip on the Netherlands, but now the northern provinces are rising up in open rebellion. It's Dutch rebels against the Spanish Habsburgs, Protestant ideals clashing with Catholic rule, and as one of the rebel leaders, Sonoy wants to pin down exactly where my loyalties lie. I'm hauled into a cold, draft-ridden cell under Eindhoven, where his men waste no time getting started. Their interrogation feels both vicious and confusing. They bark questions, demanding answers I simply don't have, and all I can do is repeat that I've got nothing useful to offer. Sonoy watches the whole thing with this hard, icy stare that never wavers. He's not buying a word of it. It doesn't take long before he gets bored with the whole routine. With a flick of his hand toward one of the guards, he signals that it's time to move on to the next phase. My shirt is yanked off, leaving my chest bare to the clammy chill of the dungeon, and then I notice a guard stepping toward me. He's holding a basket, or really more of a wicker cage. His boots echo on the stone floor, but there's another sound too. Something faint and alive, a sort of squeaking and hissing coming from inside that basket. And then I see it. Right there, inches from my exposed stomach, is a tangled cluster of writhing, squealing rats. Rat torture has a strange, shaky place in history. On one hand, it makes perfect sense that someone might try using rats to terrify prisoners. Plenty of folks are scared stiff of them, and even if you're not the type who screams at the sight of a rodent, the idea of a whole swarm of them scurrying across your skin or chewing at you isn't exactly comforting. So for a man like Sonoy, looking to squeeze information out of his Catholic prisoners in new and twisted ways, rats probably seemed like a solid choice. But on the other hand, there aren't many solid records of rat torture ever truly being used. The whole concept kind of lingers on the edges of history, somewhere between actual fact and grim folklore. Honestly, the most famous example of rat torture comes from what amounts to a rumor. It was just a tale passed between two soldiers. This is the story of Ernst Lanza, someone I've talked about more deeply in my video The History of Nightmares. Lanza had been an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army in the early 1900s when a fellow soldier told him a disturbing tale. This soldier described a torture supposedly used in China, where a live rat would be shoved into a pot. That pot would then be strapped tightly against the victim's bare backside. The torturers would heat the bottom of the pot with a red-hot poker until the metal burned hotter and hotter, driving the rat into a frenzy. The rat, panicking, would face two options: sit there and burn alive, or try to escape by clawing and chewing its way out through the poor victim's anus. And of course, the rat chose escape. It's a revolting, unsettling story, enough to make anyone's skin crawl. But for Lanza, it became something far worse. He fixated on it, convinced that this horrific torture might one day be used on him, or on his girlfriend, or even on his father. If this rings a bell, that's because Lanza eventually became one of Sigmund Freud's most famous case studies. Freud met with him regularly for about 3 months starting in October 1907. If you want a deep dive into the Ratman case, I cover all that in The History of Nightmares too. Long story short, Lanza was dealing with some serious mental health struggles, dark fantasies of murder and suicide, along with a whole list of compulsive, irrational behaviors. The rat story struck some nerve inside him, and over the years it grew into an obsession he just couldn't shake. Even so, he stayed in the army and eventually died in the First World War along with more than 1 million other Austro-Hungarian soldiers. Whether he ever managed to get rid of that particular demon is something we'll probably never know. But it does raise the question, where did that grim story even come from? On the surface, it feels like pure invention, a bit of turn-of-the-century Western fantasy about the mysterious East. Around that time, China was often portrayed as this exotic, dangerous place full of strange customs and brutal punishments. The Daily Mail even ran a whole series trashing the Chinese communities living in London, fixating on opium dens and supposed filth and moral decay. Over in America, writer Jack London had a phase where China was his go-to subject. When he wasn't writing about heroic sled dogs in the Yukon, He churned out pieces like The Yellow Peril and The Unparalleled Invasion, where he fretted about China threatening the Western world. So if Lanza's comrade wanted to invent a terrifying torture story and make it even more dreadful, setting it in China would have been an easy choice. Of course, it's also possible he didn't invent anything at all. Maybe he just confused fiction with reality. Back in 1899, French author Octave Mirbeau wrote a novel called The Torture Garden, and part of the story centers on a woman named Clara who takes disturbing pleasure in witnessing all sorts of cruel, imaginative executions. One scene in particular must have stuck with that officer because yes, rats show up in the exact way Lanza described. And yes, the scene takes place in China as well. So maybe the officer read The Torture Garden, or heard about it secondhand, and jumbled the details. Or maybe he just wanted to scare the life out of poor Lanza, and if that was his goal, he definitely succeeded. But that leaves the big question. Was the story pure fiction, or did it have some real-world roots? Honestly, it might be a mix of both. Even though Mirbeau took plenty of creative liberties in his depiction of rat torture, there are a few historical examples that echo the idea, but none of them come from China. Instead of tracing those stories back to China, the real historical examples actually come from much closer to the author's own Persian roots. The first one appears only about 100 miles north of where he lived, right in the Netherlands. When the Dutch rose up against the Spanish Habsburgs in the 1560s, they set off a long, bloody conflict that dragged on for decades and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The Dutch rebels were led by William the Silent, the Prince of Orange, but even someone of his stature needed strong allies. Some of his loudest, most passionate supporters came from a group called the Guizen, the Beggars. These were nobles who dedicated themselves to driving the Spanish out of the Netherlands and pushing Protestantism ahead of what they believed was a corrupt, heretical Catholic rule. And within that group, few were more zealous than a politician and military commander named Diederik Sonoy. Sonoy was the kind of man who seemed to pride himself on his cruelty. He was fanatical in his religion and ruthless in his methods. Torture wasn't just a tool for him, it was a passion. He'd use anything he thought might break a prisoner's resolve, and one of his favorite tricks was the rat torture. The process worked like this. The prisoner would be stripped to the waist and tied down spread eagle on a table or platform. Then the torturers would take a cage filled with rats and set it upside down on the person's stomach, letting the rats scramble and claw right against bare skin. After that, they'd bring out the hot coals. The prisoner would be told that these glowing coals were about to be pressed against the bottom of the cage, heating the metal until the rats went wild. As the story went, the heat would send the rats into a panic, forcing them to dig downward, straight into the victim's belly. They'd rip through skin, muscle, and sinew on their way to the internal organs. The suffering would have been unimaginable. But in practice, most people didn't get that far. Just hearing what was about to happen was usually enough. The threat alone made them spill whatever secrets they had long before any hot coals came near the cage. Once they talked, the victim was usually hanged anyway, but at least they were spared the long, nightmarish agony of being slowly gnawed apart. And if, by some miracle, they survived that ordeal, they'd still face days of septic shock and peritonitis that would almost certainly finish the job. We don't know for sure who endured Sonoy's particular version of this torture. A Franciscan lay brother named Engelbert Terbroek was definitely tortured by Sonoy's men after Alkmaar fell in 1572, but whether rats were part of his suffering is still unclear. Our second example takes us closer to Mirbeau's home in Paris, just a short trip across the English Channel. Much like Sonoy's interrogations, this version targeted Catholics too, but the English approach to rat torture had its own twist. When George Lillycrake and Charles Macfarlane were putting together their History of England in the 1840s, they uncovered accounts of a cell in the Tower of London called the Dungeon Among the Rats. This underground cell supposedly sat below the Thames's high water mark, which meant the river flooded it daily, bringing in filthy water and sewage. And with every flood came, in their words, innumerable rats from the riverbanks, forced through cracks and holes in the walls straight into the cell. So in England, the rats weren't tools the torturers brought in. They were simply part of the room's horrific design. This dungeon was reportedly used by Queen Elizabeth I to break the will of Catholic prisoners starting around 1588. Crake and Macfarlane wrote that the rats' sudden swarming was the least terrifying part of it all. The real horror came from what the creatures did once the prisoners fell asleep, tearing flesh off their arms and legs with what the writers called their well-known voracity. All of this sounds awful enough, but it also feels like something that happened in a distant, almost alien world. It's tempting for modern listeners like me to take comfort in the idea that this cruelty existed centuries ago, in a time we've supposedly moved past. But that comfort doesn't hold up. Because in the late 20th century, 400 years after Sonoe and Elizabeth, the practice of rat torture resurfaced. This time, it was used by brutal dictatorships that were discovering new and creative ways to control and crush dissent. In the 1960s and 70s, a wave of military coups swept across South America. In Brazil, the armed forces toppled President João Goulart in a U.S. backed coup in 1964, kicking off nearly 21 years of military rule. In Chile, in September 1973, General Augusto Pinochet led a violent coup that overthrew socialist President Salvador Allende. Allende died by suicide inside the presidential palace, and Pinochet held on to power for the next 17 years. Then, in 1976, Argentina's military deposed President Isabel Perón. She'd been both the third wife and the vice president of Juan Perón, and after his death in 1974, she became the first woman anywhere in the world to hold the office of president. But her time in power lasted barely 2 years before the military tossed her out. What followed was the so-called national reorganization process, a 7-year stretch of harsh authoritarian rule. These regimes all differed in their politics and personalities, but one detail links them back to our central theme. Each of them relied on rat torture to intimidate, silence, and dominate their prisoners. In 2014, during testimony before Brazil's Truth Commission, former Army Colonel Paulo Malhes openly admitted to using psychological torture while working under the junta. He explained that he preferred methods that left no physical marks, saying it was far more effective than brute force, especially when the goal was to flip militants into informants. To do that, he preyed on deep, primal human fears. Malhes and his team used swarming masses of rats to break prisoners mentally. They also used snakes and even crocodiles when the situation called for it. Surprisingly, Malhes said he'd been trained in the United Kingdom, claiming Britain was the best place to learn the techniques of psychological torture, and insisting that psychological pain was always the most efficient weapon. I should point out here that the Brazilian junta didn't rely solely on psychological torment. They used plenty of physical torture as well. When Brazil's president, Dilma Rousseff, stood before the Truth Commission in 2014 to deliver its findings, she openly wept, and she had every reason to. Rousseff herself had been imprisoned by the regime years earlier, beaten, and shocked with electricity during her captivity. The junta wasn't just after information, they were out to completely crush people, body and mind. That meant using a whole range of methods designed to break someone down on every level. Similar stories surfaced in Chile too. An Amnesty International investigation found multiple accounts of rat torture used by the CNI intelligence services. According to the report, prisoners were kept in hot, humid rooms known as crofano, or the operating theater. Some people were strapped to a table so short it could only hold half their body, leaving their upper torso hanging in midair for hours. The pressure on the lower back caused stabbing, agonizing pain. Amnesty also found that prisoners were blasted with deafening noise, had their hair yanked out, were dragged across rough stone floors, and were sometimes shut inside rooms with rats or even an aggressive dog. One anonymous 19-year-old woman said she endured all this in Santiago in 1981. Throughout nearly 3 weeks of captivity, she was severely beaten and assaulted again and again. At one point, interrogators told her that her partner had been executed. They even took her to a morgue and showed her a man's corpse. She didn't think the body was actually her partner's, but the shock of that moment left a deep scar. She also recalled being locked inside a room filled with rats. A psychological attack layered on top of the physical abuse and sexual humiliation she had already suffered. Meanwhile, over in neighboring Argentina, the military regime used rats in a different, more sadistic way. They weren't interested in the psychological angle, they wanted maximum pain and degradation. When Argentina's National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, CONAA, DEP, launched its investigation in 1983. It uncovered massive human rights violations. The Commission's final report, Nunca Más, Never Again, spanned 50,000 pages. In those pages were testimonies describing about 300 secret detention centers where nearly 9,000 people were murdered between 1976 and 1977 alone. And the accounts of torture were endless. One torture method documented by CONADEP was called the rectoscope. A tube would be inserted into a prisoner's body, and then a live rat would be forced inside. The terrified animal's claws and teeth would tear at internal tissue, causing extreme injury and pain that's difficult to even imagine. According to the report, this method was used most often on Jewish prisoners, though others were subjected to it as well. When the junta fell in 1983, these horrors finally came to an end, but the trauma from those years still hangs over the country today, even nearly half a century later. Rat torture is powerful precisely because it taps into some of our oldest, deepest fears. Even long before scientists figured out that fleas on rats helped spread the Black Plague, people were afraid of rodents. Musophobia, a fear of rats and mice, is very real, and plenty of folks fall apart at the sight of even a harmless little mouse scurrying across the floor. It's not really about disease, it's just that rats are creepy. They're unsettling on a gut level. That's why writers like George Orwell and Edgar Allan Poe leaned on rats to create horror. It's why rat torture shows up everywhere in pop culture, from Game of Thrones to Too Fast, Too Furious. And it's why the producers of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, love tossing celebrities into challenges involving these squirming little creatures. But the truth is, rat torture is wildly impractical in real life. Rats are hard to control, tough to keep alive in large numbers, and nearly impossible to corral into a single, predictable direction. This is probably why historical records of actual rat torture are so rare. Why go through the trouble of designing some elaborate setup involving rats when beatings, blades, and simpler tools already served the same ugly purpose? More often than not, it wasn't the rat torture itself. It was the idea of it that broke someone's will. Craik and McFarlane described that rat-infested dungeon in the Tower of London in gory detail, but they never produced hard proof that anyone was actually tortured there. And it's tough to imagine many people lying quietly while sonoise baskets of rats supposedly chewed their way through a person's gut. In both cases, the threat alone was probably enough to make people talk long before any real torture began. And that's not to dismiss the very real suffering of the people who were subjected to rat torture, because some truly were. The anonymous Chilean woman from 1981 endured an experience that was nothing short of nightmarish. She likely carried the physical and emotional scars of those weeks for years, maybe the rest of her life. But thankfully, cases like hers have been relatively rare in the long sweep of human history. As terrible as these tortures have been, the truth is that you're far more likely to encounter rats used in a grisly scene at the end of a horror novel, during a big moment in a movie, or on some reality show challenge than in real life. And honestly, for all our sakes, I hope it stays that way.